Good morning, everyone. I have to say this is my first time in Padua, and as a Galileo scholar, at least part-time Galileo scholar, I'm of course particularly excited and honored to be here and to give a talk on Galileo in Padua. So I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity, for inviting me, and I will get right to it. In 1957, Stillman Drake made the Saggiatore, to which this session is devoted, on its 400th anniversary, available to the English-speaking world in his discoveries and opinions of Galileo. It was in this book that he coined the label Galileo's Scientific Manifesto for the Assayer. As John Heilbronn has just admirably demonstrated, this label is a misnomer and does not truly capture the character and essence of the book. I couldn't agree more. However, alongside the quote about the book of the universe being written in the language of mathematics, it's exactly this label that has stuck and significantly influenced the broad reception of the work, but also permeated more serious scholarship, as evidenced, for instance, by this quote from Ron Naylor. I quote, "The Assayer has been described as both as Galileo's scientific manifesto and the greatest polemic ever written in physical science, a work regarded as testimony to Galileo's commitment to the scientific method." The Assayer has indeed been heavily relied upon when reconstructing Galileo's methodology, perceived to be the backbone of his scientific works, most prominently the Discorsi, with their pronounced mathematico-physical character. More rigorous scholarship has, as we've just witnessed, of course paid due attention to the evolution of Galileo's thought over time and placed the Assayer within the precise context and circumstances of its writing. To this, I have little to add. In fact, I must confess that when I was invited to give this talk, I hadn't revisited the Assayer in nearly 20 years. What I had done, however, was to study in detail the emergence of Galileo's new science of motion, which culminated 15 tumultuous years after the Assayer with the publication of the Discorsi. My research has brought about a new enriched understanding of Galileo's explorations into the problem of motion. I will here outline my findings to show where Galileo stood with his novel theory in 1623 when he penned the Assayer, and briefly trace the journey that led him to this point. I will then come back to the Assayer to ponder how a new understanding of the development of Galileo's mathematical theory of motion might add to our understanding of the book, or vice versa. That Galileo had been working on a theory of motion long before 1623 is widely recognized. This understanding is primarily derived from various scattered remarks in his correspondence. Particularly notable in this respect are a handful of letters. The first was written to Guidobaldo del Monte in 1602, wherein Galileo engages with the problem of the inclined plane and enthusiastically communicates his insight into the isochronism of the pendulum. The second is a letter addressed to Paolo Sapi in 1604, in which Galileo makes reference to the law of fall and claims to have proven the law based on a principle which, as we know, he later dismissed as erroneous. A series of letters exchanged in 1609 with Luca Valerio show Galileo has picked up work on the problems of motion again, and in the same year Galileo writes to Cosimo II de' Medici stating that he is occupato in alcune contemplazioni ed in diverse esperienze attinenti al mio trattato, and that he is still working in particular on some problems regarding projectile motion. The exact nature and progress of this work on the problems of motion during this Paduan period, however, remain elusive based on these sources alone, and in 1967 Macmullen indeed speculated that, I quote, "we shall never be able to reconstruct the sequence of steps that led Galileo to the Discorsi. The evidence available in scattered remarks in letters or in the Dialogo and Discorsi is scant and very ambiguous." Fortunately, Macmullen was not correct with this projection. Besides the correspondence, another source has survived to fill the gap in our understanding, Galileo's so-called Notes on Motion. These notes consist of approximately 165 pages, today bound as part of MS Gal 72. The manuscript contains mostly unordered, almost chaotic compilation of calculations, drawings, and texts The contents span a wide range from single numbers to complex calculations, from penmanship tests to intricate geometrical constructions, and from incomplete sentences to full drafts of propositions as they later appeared in the Discorsi. Notably, the manuscript has entered the focus of Galilean scholarship only rather late, beginning in the 1970s. Since then, much effort has been invested in understanding this intricate source. Studies into the notes on motion more often than not deal only with a limited number of selected entries. The closest to an overall interpretation of the conceptual development of Galileo's theory as represented by the entirety of the notes on motion is Winifred Weisen's groundbreaking analysis published as The New Science of Motion, a Study of Galileo's De Motu Locali in 1974. Inspired by my reading of the chapter on Galileo in Exploring the Limits of Preclassical Mechanics, I dedicated several years to reanalyzing the manuscript. The results of my work are published in Swinging and Rolling, Unveiling Galileo's Unorthodox Path from a Challenging Problem to a New Science, which came out in 2019. Before delving into my findings, allow me to briefly introduce 4 propositions used by Galileo that I reference in my exposition later. This will help those unfamiliar with Galileo's work to follow discussion. For Galileo experts, while this might seem basic, please bear with me and consider it a refresher of your memory. The first proposition, Galileo's celebrated law of fall, states a quadratic relation between spaces traversed and times elapsed in accelerated motion. In Galileo's own words in the Discorsi, I quote, "The spaces described by a body falling from rest with uniformly accelerated motion are to each other as the squares of the time intervals employed in traversing these spaces, these distances." Next is the law of chords, presented here again in Galileo's own words. If from the highest or lowest point of a vertical circle there be drawn any inclined planes meeting the circumference, the times of descent along these chords are each equal to the other. This statement, alluded to for the first time in the letter to Guidobaldo del Monte in 1602, may initially sound surprising, but it is entirely correct according to classical mechanics. The isochronism of the pendulum states that the oscillation period of a pendulum is independent of its initial elongation, that is, the angle of the arc the pendulum is swinging through. In the words of Galileo from the very same letter to Guidobaldo, motions within the same quarter circle are made in equal times. According to Viviani, Galileo first recognized this property of pendulum motion around 1582 when observing the swinging of a chandelier in the Cathedral of Pisa. The law of the pendulum, finally, relates the length of a pendulum to its period of oscillation. It is mentioned in writing casually and in passing in the discussions of the first day of the Discorsi. I quote, "As to the times of vibration of bodies suspended by threads of different lengths, they bear to each other the same proportion as the square roots of the length of the thread. Or one might say the lengths are to each other as the squares of the times." It is unclear when Galileo first became aware of the law of the pendulum. He never explicitly claimed priority for its discovery, but did reference and use the law in the notes on motion on folio pages that can be dated to his Pageant period. With these preliminary remarks, we are prepared to delve somewhat into my reconstruction of the genesis of Galileo's theory of motion. I will begin by quoting the opening paragraphs of my book in abridged form. If a small ball tied to a string and suspended from a pivot is displaced from its equilibrium position and then let go, the period of swing is independent of the initial displacement. If instead the ball rolls down along an inclined plane connecting a point on the arc of pendulum swing to its equilibrium position, the time of motion is independent of the inclination of the plane. Moreover, if the pendulum string is lengthened or shortened, the period of the pendulum increases or decreases in proportion to the root of the length of the string. If, on the other hand, one lets the ball roll down over a longer or shorter distance on the inclined plane, the time of motion is found to increase or decrease with the root of the distance fallen. On the phenomenological level, swinging and rolling thus seem to manifest a remarkable similarity. They certainly did for Galileo. Is this similarity a mere coincidence from which nothing can be learned? Galileo certainly didn't think so. For him, the challenging similarity he perceived between swinging and rolling bestowed the key to deeper insights. Despite immense effort, Galileo was never able to meet the challenge and recover the similarity he perceived between the two types of motion theoretically. Yet, it was his inquiry into the relation between swinging and rolling which gave rise to and essentially shaped his new science of motion. In the approximately 450 pages that follow, I painstakingly and meticulously anchor and justify my interpretation amidst the intricate labyrinth of the notes on motion. If you want to learn more, I recommend, however, not immediately diving into the book with all its exhaustive details. Instead, consider reading the extensive essay review by Martin van Dijk, recently published in Centaurus. In a congenial manner, it captures the essence of my findings without getting lost in the overwhelming minutiae. Today, I will first describe in some detail what I believe to be the pivotal experiment from which Galileo's considerations concerning naturally accelerated motion took off, and then briefly summarize the subsequent developments. The record of this experiment, in which Galileo timed the swinging of a pendulum and the naturally accelerated motion along an inclined plane and linked these in a very specific manner, can be found on folio 189 verso. I would be delighted to guide you through the reconstruction of this captivating page, step by step, as this is an instance where every number and every entry can clearly be understood, allowing Galileo's procedures to be reconstructed with no or only minimal ambiguity, which is admittedly not always the case. Unfortunately, time constraints prevent this, and I must present the experiment in a nutshell instead. Galileo started by timing the swinging of a pendulum, approximately 2 meters in length. The time he measured for a quarter swing was 62 of his units. In the next step, Galileo timed the rolling of a ball along a fairly lengthy, gently inclined plane. Based on the numbers in the manuscript, it can be deduced that the plane was approximately 6.5 meters long and inclined at an angle of 8 degrees. The duration Galileo recorded for the motion along this plane is 280. It is worth noting that the dimensions of this experimental plane align almost precisely with those Galileo provided for the inclined plane, which he, according to his own description in the Discorsi, used to test the law of fall. With my reconstruction of the pendulum plane experiment, any remaining doubt as to whether Galileo indeed experimented with such an inclined plane, an 18th century reconstruction of which you can now see in the presentation, can thus ultimately be dispelled. The even more intriguing part starts when Galileo connects these two measurements and consequently the two motions by means of a theoretical argument. Firstly, by applying the law of chords, he deduces that the time it takes to fall freely along a vertical equal to a diameter of a vast circle within which his experimental plane could be inscribed as a chord would also amount to 280. Then, by invoking the law of fall, he computes the fall time vertically along a significantly shorter distance, namely the diameter of the arc described by his pendulum. This is equivalent to twice the pendulum's length, that is roughly about 4 meters. His calculations yield a time of 80 2/3 to fall freely over this vertical distance. In a final step, Galileo reapplies the law of chords, concluding that this is also the time in which the chord CB, or any chord that can be inscribed into the pendulum arc for that matter, would be covered in naturally accelerated motion. As a result, he can now directly juxtapose the time taken to swing through the arc CB, as measured in the first step, with the time deduced for the fall along the chord CB itself. Why would Galileo make this comparison, and what insight did he hope to gain? Galileo had designed the experiment to test the straightforward hypothesis that a pendulum would take the same time to swing from rest to its lowest point in its circular path as a heavy object would need to fall or roll along an inclined plane intersecting this arc as a chord. This assumption, which I call the single chord hypothesis, would provide the simplest, most straightforward explanation for the challenging similarity he had perceived. Indeed, the law of fall and the law of chords would directly imply the law of the pendulum motion and the isochronism of the pendulum and vice versa if the single chord hypothesis held. However, Galileo's results did not align with his expectation. The times he had measured and deduced from his measurements, respectively, were not equal at all. They deviated by around 30%. Among the factors which contributed to this observed deviation is the difference between rolling and sliding that Galileo remained entirely unaware of. The negative outcome of the experiment was, however, not the end of Galileo's ambitions. Indeed, the single chord hypothesis had not strictly been implied, and thus could be modified to a new, more appropriate conceptualization. Galileo's refined conceptualization rests on two assumptions. First, fall of a heavy body along a concave surface supported from below is kinematically equivalent to the swinging of a pendulum bob along the same arc, supported, however, from above. And second, if the arc is exhausted by an inscribed polygon with a number of sides increasing above all limits, the kinematics of fall along the polygonal path will ever more closely resemble the kinematics of fall along the arc itself. In particular, the times for both motions will converge. Galileo's elaboration of the broken chord approach are documented on quite a number of pages in the manuscript, of which I show two on the slide. These 2 pages show that Galileo had painstakingly computed the motion times for an 8-chord approximation of the quarter arc. The broken chord approach bestowed Galileo with quite a number of new and challenging problems. He managed to address some, leading, among others, to the formulation of first new theorems, such as the law of the broken chord or the ex mechanicis proof of the law of chords, both of which he alludes to in the 1602 letter to Guidobaldo. However, the solution to certain other problems remained elusive to Galileo, and from a modern perspective, it's amply clear why. I quote again, "Pendular motion is not isochronous. The similarity Galileo conceived was a chimera. According to all evidence, however, Galileo never forfeited this conviction for the similarity and remained convinced that his research program could, in principle, be crowned with the success not granted to him. Almost coincidentally, as a spin-off, he was granted with a much larger success. The attempt to save his firm conviction, almost in passing, bestowed him with the new science which he has been praised for by the history of science." End of quote. Oh. While the prevalent belief is that Galileo began his exploration of accelerated motion only in 1604, Galileo's work, I've summarized thus far, has to be predated. Ancillary calculations on a sheet which Galileo otherwise had used to copy a diagram from Gilbert's De Magnete let us date his work on the broken chord approach. This diagram was not copied identically, but with modifications that show Galileo had penned it in reaction to a question that Paolo Sapi, in a letter sent in September 1602, had posed to him concerning this very construction. It is thus evident that Galileo's new science initiated already in 1602, and that the very research agenda that catalyzed its emergence already lurks between the lines of the letter to Guidobaldo sent only 2 months later. In the second part of my book, Novel Insights and Old Concepts from Exploration to Formalization, I show that Galileo immediately, that is as early as 1602, was working towards the publication of his new findings. He made clear copies of the most important results he had achieved up to that point and organized them into a deductive structure. In particular, he began to think about a foundation for his new science based on more fundamental principles. In his attempt to integrate and anchor his new insights in the concepts of the contemporary frameworks of natural philosophy and mechanics, Galileo started to invoke in particular the notion of velocity and considerations regarding the causation of motion. Yet, his attempts in this respect soon ran into a problem, showing that for now his assumptions about velocity and causation of accelerated motion were not reconcilable. The recognition of this complication brought Galileo's search for a foundational basis to a halt. The letter which Galileo sent to Sappi in 1604, rather than marking the discovery of the law of fall, as is commonly held, rather indicates Galileo's relief at having found a way out of the deadlock that he had run into approximately 2 years earlier when searching for a foundation. The seeming solution was, however, soon revealed to be untenable when Galileo realized that the principle which he had applied to characterize the change of velocity in naturally accelerated motion in his proof was actually not compliant with the law of fall itself. This is where my book ends in 1604. As I have promised to discuss where Galileo stood with his work on motion in 1623, let me briefly recap the subsequent events. An intense phase of work in 1609 did not bring the breakthrough he had hoped for. Hence, when in 1610 he sent a letter to Belsario Winter, secretary to the Grand Duke, and promised a new theory of motion, Galileo had to concede that this work was still in progress. However, he emphasized that he would attendere con ogni mio potere a condurre a fine I frutti delle fatiche di tutti I miei studi passati, dai quali posso sperare qualche gloria. However, the telescopic discoveries, the nuncius, his relocation to Florence, his promotion to the position of chief mathematician and philosopher shifted his focus. The controversy on floating bodies further sidetracked Galileo from his investigation into motion. It seems he returned to these studies with the earnest intention of completing what he had begun in 1602 only around 1618. To organize the existing material, Galileo enlisted Mario Guiducci and Niccolò Arrighetti to make copies. The two meticulously transcribed Galileo's initial theorems on motion, likely working side by side. This most probably happened in the summer of 1618, as evidenced by a letter in which Castelli sends casual greetings to the duo then staying with Galileo. Some of these copies contain, albeit sparse, additions by Galileo himself, indicating his intention to finish what he had so eagerly promised before. However, he was once again sidetracked. The three comets appeared in 1618, and we've just been reminded of the events that ensued, starting with the publication of the Discorso delle Comete under Guiducci's name. If we reread the Saggiatore, bearing in mind this understanding of where Galileo stood with his theory of motion in 1623, it becomes even more evident that the text is not the comprehensive pronouncement of Galileo's scientific methodology it has frequently been portrayed as. Indeed, aspects one would expect to find if the Assayer included the methodological foundation of Galileo's work on motion are notably absent. For instance, while Galileo emphasizes the primary role of empirical observation and sense experience in the book and even proposes some observational experiments based on everyday items, a discussion on the role of experimentation is entirely missing, despite the fact that it had played a fundamental role in the emergence of the new science of motion. What I did perceive, however, when I reread the Assayer was the development of Galileo's theory of motion in the back of my mind was a strong psychological motive that I would like to share with you. It is essential to remember that Galileo was nearing 60 when the Assayer was published. Up to that point, his publication record was still relatively modest, quite in contrast to his general demeanor in the Assayer. While the Nuncius had certainly made an impact, we should not forget that his two, from a modern perspective, major scientific works, the Dialogue and especially Discorsi, with their two new mathematical sciences, had not yet been released. Though Galileo famously asserted in the Assayer that the universe book is written in the language of mathematics, there is a notable absence of mathematics in the work itself. This extends to the other works he had published up to that point and referenced in the Assayer. The one work which tackled a fundamental aspect of nature and was indeed deeply rooted in triangles, circles, and other geometric figures was, as we have seen, near completion, but had not been presented to the public. It must have been immensely frustrating for Galileo not to be able to throw his new theory of motion into Sarsi Crassi's face. showcasing that the formidable challenge of founding a new science based on the idea of a mathematical constitution of the universe could indeed be met. This must have weighed heavily on him, especially since, as we've seen, he had long promised this work not only to his friends and peers, but also to his patron. Even if the Saggiatore is revealed to be less of an exposition of Galileo's scientific methodology than commonly assumed, the question regarding his methodological stance in relation to his theory of motion can of course be posed independently. Opinions on this vary widely. In the words of William Wallace, I quote, "Galileo has been seen alternately as a Platonist whose rationalist insights enabled him to read the book of nature because it was written in the language of mathematics, and as an experimentalist who used the hypothetical deductive method of modern science to establish his new results empirically. My reconstruction of the development of Galileo's theory of motion draws quite a different picture, which Martin van Dijk in his review has summarized as follows. When treating pendular motion as a problem, Galileo was first and foremost a mathematician in the 16th century sense of the category. He was exploring mathematical constructions that could represent different relations between quantities that could in principle be empirically measured. His notes testify to a search for a way to simultaneously meet the double mathematical constraint of geometrical constructibility and empirical validity. This heuristically oriented approach resembles neither the inductive nor the hypothetical deductive ways of proceeding that framed much of the earlier discussions on Galileo. It's not general questions concerning the nature of free fall that led Galileo towards his groundbreaking results, but a very specific mathematical challenge in which the behavior of a simple object, such as a pendulum, was put in relation with another kind of motion, that of balls rolling down inclined planes. Significantly, neither of these had any place in natural philosophical debates on motion. The kind of questions he was asking about them at this point were not primarily driven by specifically philosophical concerns, apart from the mere fact that he was interested in the treatment of motion." End of quote. In 1623, Galileo had all reason to believe in the feasibility of a mathematical theory of motion that could be aligned with the existing philosophical discourse. This conviction likely played a significant role in inspiring his renowned and often quoted phrase, which justly earns the acclaim it has received. La filosofia è scritta, and we've already heard this. With these words, Galileo masterfully turned a personal challenge into an advantage. Though the discorsi wouldn't be published for another 15 years, they would forever be interpreted through the lens of this impactful statement. One has to give him that on the occasion of this 400th anniversary. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Is there any question or comments?
Yes, I remember Stillman Drake making a comparison between the time of the swinging of the pendulum and the fall along a chord. You showed that different. You had the 62 tempos, and you showed an 80 tempos. Mm-hmm. So that's taking into account the rolling according to your reconstruction, because Stillman Drake had a longer time. Yeah. He had 83.5, if I remember well, making a comparison with another folio, but a separate one.
Well, Thank you for this question. Yes, so Drake's assumption basically is that Galileo was aware of the difference and also of the factor that mediates between those two times. The one for rolling of an object down an inclined plane, the other for sliding, and this is not very plausible. And there's a long argument that could be made here that the dimensions of the plane that he listed in his experimental record are, and this is a very modern concept, already adjusted dimensions for the sliding. So it would be the length of a plane that has, traversed in the same time had the ball been sliding instead of rolling. To back up this speculation, he pointed to one specific folio page where he thought this particular ratio occurred. It can be shown that these considerations pertain to a completely different subject. So I think, in essence, it's very implausible, and also there are arguments that can be made from the further development of Galileo's thoughts on that problem, that he was not aware of this difference, and Drake's interpretation essentially has to be dismissed, I think, here. And there's, again, you find a longer version of that in the book.
There is another question from Pietro Daniel Amadeo.
Thank you, Jochen. So do you still see the Assayer Il Saggiatore as a methodological manifesto? And if so, how do we have to revise it in the light of geometrical modeling and risk measurement, as you and our reviewer pointed out?
Thank you, Pietro, for the question. No, I don't. I do read it quite along the line that Jen Heilbronn has presented to us in its specific context. And of course, you can, in a bit eclectic fashion, take out certain remarks and apply them to the development of his theory of motion as he would later publish it. And some will, of course, fit. They will fit because they are of great generality. But I don't still see this specifically drafted with the theory of motion in the back of his mind. It was really drafted in the context we have been described, and there's this one golden, as I tried to point out, phrase that then was so fitting and for what he would later publish.